All right, for everyone that are linked in, study unit 2.4 today. A quick recap on what we have done. The development of science throughout history, the three important times, the time of the Renaissance, the pre-modernism. I have spoken of it as a time in which in the metaphysical was believed and then it was accepted, but in a more practical sense that which was taught from a pulpit was taken without criticism. The time of the Enlightenment, where that led into modernism with the emphasis on man's mind, is that the rationalism and positivism, and then the postmodern time in which we live today, which began just after the end of the Second World War, where as a relativistic approach to science, that as science as a whole. Last week we looked specifically at fundamentalism and the Christian Science to have a look at how or what the role is of faith in science. Fundamentalism, which leaves no space for the rational, and the Christian Science, which gives us a balanced version of how faith plays a role in science. Or how would a Christian scientist approach his field of study? That as a whole. We want to specifically focus on theology as a science. At this university we have a faculty of theology. Can we say that it is a science in itself? There is a lot of criticism. We will later on have a discussion on it. We'll look at criticism against theology as a science. That is the outcomes that we must reach. Can theology be seen as a science? What is the nature of theology as a science of faith? What is the content, foundation, methods, boundaries, and challenges of theology? And what is the connection between theology and the previous models of science? That is our outcomes. A few weeks ago told you and referred you to Hebrews 11 verse 3. By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. With the emphasis, by faith we understand. Because we know, we understand. The importance of this is the point of departure in faith, and that is at the forefront when we ask whether theology is a science. In the rationalism, we would typically find the approach of only when I know something will I believe it, or will I accept it as the truth. If I can show something, if I can point it out, and if I can review it and verify it, and I can do it again and again, then I will believe it. That's the rationalistic approach. Our belief says, I believe and therefore I know. Our first outcome. Can theology be seen as a science? Theology is the two things which by now you know is made up of two things. Theos, which is God, and Logos, word. So in the theology it is about the science of God, how to know more about God and how to, that which He reveals Himself, to learn more on that. The development of theology as a science. We must keep in mind, we don't keep it quiet. At the end we come and we say theology is a science, but we need to step through the ages so that we can come to a point where we can say, all right, because of all of this, theology is a science. The early Middle Ages was the time in which the idea was phased out that there is more than one God that exists. religions came to the realization more and more that there's one great being, and that he created, and that religions which existed moved away from the idea to pray to more than one God, to glorify him and exalt his name. The foundation for this early phase of science in the Middle Ages, or in the early Middle Ages, and now I'm speaking of before the 12th century, the attempt was to find out and think about the godly being as something that is apart from man. And that was the focus of what we will call today theology. They did not have the word yet, but that was the focus during the time up to the 12th century, to try and point out the existence of God. A bit later, in the Middle Ages, 12th, 13th centuries, and a bit later on, the science became more systematic, and the theology, as we would call it today, also tried to include the studying of the revelation of God as an independent source, as a way in which there can be found knowledge of God. And for the first time, in that time, the term theologia was used to describe the activity to get to know more about God. And under that, they saw the discipline of the holy doctrine. That was their view of theology. The time of the Enlightenment, we focused on that at an earlier chance. We now know that during the Enlightenment, scientists moved away from anything which could not be proved by the mind. And we also saw that in the time of the Enlightenment, the gravamonds came in that God cannot be proved. And therefore there is not something like, one wants to almost say like a God, because it can't be proven. The focus of science, which has anything to do with theology, moved away from a study of God, and that they start focusing on the study of the phenomenon of religions, meaning in that they focused on the studying of the existence of religions and how different religions execute themselves, and how they try to prove their God, on how they came to knowledge of their specific God. Now, during the time of the Enlightenment, there were questions asked. Can theology truly be seen as a science? There was especially struggled with what we call the prolegomena. Before you start with any science, with any process, there's certain things that you need to ask first. For example, I want to say I'm a natural scientist. Where will I begin with my studies? What is my object of study? What is my points of departure when I study a certain thing? In the theology, the typical prolegomena, before I even started with gathering knowledge, the prolegomena was very important during the time of the Enlightenment. And that question was, can the existence of God be proved? Now let me take you back to another example. In natural science, he would, when he starts studying species, a typical prolegomena would be, can I prove the existence of the forefathers of the species? And through research it could be shown. The prolegomena of theology, the reason tells me no, because it cannot be proved. And there, theology as a science fell away, because the reason told us that God is not unseeable, He's not verifiable, He cannot be proved with any type of scientific method. There is no way of getting to knowledge of God, and therefore theology, right off of the bat, is knocked off as a science, if according to the statements of the Enlightenment. That placed the focus on methods. Now, you would, in your reading work, you would have seen guys like Schleiermacher and Tillich and Rahner. Now, you don't need to know the names. It's theologians' names which you will later on in your studies get to do with. But because the time of the modernism does not want to give acknowledgement to say theology is a science, because the proof of God's existence couldn't be found rationally, they tried different methods to try and make theology recognizable as a science. But the problems with these methods of these guys like Schleiermacher was that eventually it made theology and reduced it to something which laid on the level of human needs and human experience. No longer a study of God, but a study of how do I experience God? What experiences do I encounter when I work with the Bible? What is my requirements before I read the Bible? So that the Bible as a document speaks to my needs. You see that reduction of theology from a study of God to a study of human experiences and human needs. But then a guy like Karl Barth came on in. And then he said, let's take all of these other human philosophies and remove them from theology. Karl Barth was one of the first guys who proved that theology is a science in its own right. Now, it's very simplistically told, but Karl Barth said, move away from this prolegomena, these questions that want to destroy theology from the beginning. He said, what needs to be said before theology is possible must make room for what needs to be said first in theology. People, it's very complex. And as I put it there, it's very simplistic to describe what was said around from the First to the Second World War in the history as a science. But bit by bit, scientists realized what science truly entails. I'll say a bit more in a minute. Don't worry too much about it. Eventually, we must, in the light of everything that happened in history, when we discuss any subject matter, argue about an area of study's scientificness, whether it's the natural science or the living sciences or engineering. Eventually science, any science, is the systemizing of knowledge, and that systemizing of knowledge is owned to the type of object that is being discussed. And the type of object is that every subject has its own methods. Every area has its own methods. Now this may become a bit Greek to you. Do you follow me? I'll explain. If you remember, in the time of the modernism, the rationalism and eventually the positivism had one specific method that they tried to push onto all forms of science. The development at the end of the modernism wants to teach us every object that is being studied is unique. In the natural sciences, an object of study would, for example, be the anatomy of a frog that must be dissected. In the managerial science, the source of object would be the way in which numbers show the reality of a firm's cash flow, and so forth. And in that way we can have at every faculty, every subject group, there's a certain object that is studied. The nature of every object differs of every other object. The nature of the object leads to it that every object must be studied according to a different method. Eventually, the information that is received by the studying of that object must be systemized. So, in other words, science is the systemizing of knowledge. I'll stop here. Systemizing of knowledge does not mean that everything you realize, you put it in one pile and now we've got science. No, systemizing of knowledge is I take all of the information that I have on my object of study and I systemize it. I put apples with apples, I sort through it, I analyze it. That which is irrelevant I throw out. I create a database of all information across the world, across time was gathered on this specific object of study. That is systemizing of knowledge. That's classifying it. That it's not just that it's not just a hopeless bunch of information that lies in a pile. So science is then the systemizing of knowledge on that specific object, and because of the nature of the object, I use a specific method. Now, this method can include either observation or thoughts, or based on the revelation in reference to the Bible. In the natural sciences, the method is experimental. In other words, they use experiments to find information. In the life sciences, it is rational tests. In the theology, it is scriptural studies. And my method leads to it that my information is added. And that information is systemized and eventually tested next to my object of study. Do you understand this? There's just an English version of that. What is the nature of theology as a science? If we now can show that theology is a science, what is the nature of that science? What does it look like? What makes it unique? What is its characteristics? Many people, and even today still, object to it that theology is a science. They say that Faculty of Theology at Northwest University must close its doors because theology is not a science. Theology is like a language. You either speak it or you don't. There's nothing more to it, nothing less. Or it's a theism. A theism is a religious system. In other words, you try and explain everything from your faith system, and if it can't explain it, then you jump back behind a rational system and say, no, but that's what I believe. You can't prove me wrong because that's what I believe. People deliver criticism on that by saying you can't just argue theology as a science because they don't use rational methods. They simply just jump back into this faith system if they can't prove something. For example, the existence of God. Kant was a philosopher. You'll get to do with him. He had criticism and said that faith is seen as a firm belief which cannot be justified by the available evidence. But theology has to do with the Christian, or with the faithful and scientific thoughts on God, and therefore later on the God of the Word. The idea to know God is not something that is strange. It is a complete biblical idea. We know God by way of Scripture. Scripture, we believe, is the self-revelation of God. For example, that means it's God's salvation for the world. Luther said that faith is necessary to understand, to hear to understand God's salvation for the world. He said it's impossible to faithfully read Scripture without hearing God's voice in it. This slide wants to point out that when we work with Scripture, then there is a big element of faith involved in our processes. Our previous class said that faith is my point of departure. I do not try and prove my faith. Information on the screen here tries and shows that I have certain predispositions when I work with my source of object or with my study, my object of study. Just as any natural scientist which works with the anatomy of an animal or the nature of a plant, or a geologist who works with the forming of the earth, the rocks and so forth, that there's a certain point of departure. I, as a theologian, have a specific point of departure when I'm busy with my study for my scientific process. A person who is an atheist, in other words, a non-Christian, he also works with a religious point of departure. If he then says that, if he looks at the rocks, if he looks at the development of the earth or the world, the astrologist, for example, an astrologist that is an atheist also have a religious point of departure. They would then rather say a non-religious one. But his point of departure is God does not exist. Everything we see in the heavens has a certain point of departure, and that is the Big Bang. That is a certain point of departure. And the same way that my faith in God triune is reality in my view, my point of departure does not influence the end result. And in the same way, the same is true for someone which is an atheist. The fact that he is an atheist does not necessarily mean that he comes to knowledge on everything. The same way that I, as a Christian, still do not have all of the answers. In the same way, an unfaithful person or an unbelieving person, an atheist, also have for all of the answers in his field of research, the geology or heavens or wherever. That very important description there, in line with Hebrews 11 verse 3. Credo ut intelligam. I believe in order to understand. I believe in order to understand. That is the crux of any science today. I will give you a chance in a minute. Every scientist, whether he wants to acknowledge it or not, and in the postmodernistic time in which we agree on it, is that you are busy with a certain presupposition in your science. Either your presupposition is faith or disbelief. A non-agreed with way of doing science is if you do not from the beginning say where you stand. There you will see, if you read articles, in the beginning a scientist will say, I do this from the point of departure of being a Christian. Or they will say, I do this from the research point of view that I do not believe in God, or that the world came from a big bang. It just not said in so many words, but in any piece of research, those presuppositions are declared, and it is acceptable that you put that forward right from the beginning. The question is that the student asked was, is it not what God would have wanted, that faith, or that we cannot know Him in full, that faith is needed? That God wanted us to not approve Him scientifically, but that faith is needed to know Him. It's difficult to ask the meaning of God's meaning in something we don't know. I would mean that it's a good idea, but it might have been God's meaning, otherwise He would have revealed Himself in full. So most probably that is indeed the case. When if we technically know everything from God, say for example, if we take a natural scientist, if we know everything that is there to know about geography, for example, then we stop doing science. And the same with God. The moment that we stop asking questions because we believe we to know, or we believe ourselves to know everything, then we have a problem. Our results in all of the sciences is always preliminary because we do not see the full picture yet. There's always an objective truth, that so that we can gather more and more knowledge. A core or a nuclear physicist, although he works with theories in the way in which molecules and atoms consists of, he always believes that his theory is the best explanation of reality, but that it is still preliminary. If his theory ends up to be the precise, exactly the same, the development of it, then he would have stopped doing science. And I think that was the meaning of God, that man can never come to the full truth of everything. And that in that sense it is to keep man humble, but that man will also acknowledge God's greatness, that there's always something bigger, further, more, that so that man can confess and acknowledge it. It is still so, the Hebrews 11:3. The question is on that screen, I believe, so that I can understand. It is in reference to the postmodernism today. Shall we not still mean I must understand so that I can believe? In a certain sense, the turnaround of what is said here is still the words of the modernism. In the relativistic time in which we live today, there is a greater openness to the place that faith can take in. Because the postmodernistic era shows a openness for different views on the same matter. It gives the chance so that faith as a point of departure can become a science. And that's why I think the statement that is on there is, it is an advantage of the postmodernistic era in which we live, that it leaves space for that. The method, the boundaries of theology creates in aspects that we mentioned now, the content, the methods, the source, the norms, and that everything comes back to Scripture. The content that is being studied, the source and the norm is Scripture. The methods that we apply in our theological work, you will remember that scheme. The methods we have is not the same methods that a natural scientist have. He works with something else. What methods do we have? We won't go into detail here on what methods we have in theology, but the methods that are used, seen broadly, is methods that are given by Scripture itself. Methods that Scripture shows us is the best ways to do it. And then the subject hermeneutics, which you will get to do with later on. One of the principles of Scripture explanation is Scripture explains itself. There's many other principles when you must create methods, is the Scripture is his own interpreter. It was the meaning of Scripture of God so that Scripture will be understood. He makes himself known through it, and through that it is an acknowledgement of the Bible that it is a revelationary book, that it is not the meaning of God that the Bible must be close to us, or if there are certain parts of the Bible that we don't understand, it's because of the corrupt creation. The meaning of God is that the Bible must be understood, and therefore there are certain guidelines so that we can say the Bible is its own interpreter, and therefore there are certain boundaries placed, and that boundaries is done within the Scripture. We can't say we want to do X, Y, Z if it's not in the revelationary source. Then there's many examples thereof. We cannot know more of God than what He Himself reveals in the Bible. We can't know more of angels than what God Himself reveals on angels in the Bible. But eventually, if in the dogmatics you go forward, then you will see the Bible is enough. It is enough in the sense that everything which is necessary for us to know is in the Bible. But that statement, that the Bible is enough, is a very important statement in dogmatics that immediately points out the boundaries in theology. We cannot know more of God than what God reveals of Himself in the Bible. The connection between theology and the previous scientific models. The modernism, you will remember, the reason was raised to the source of knowledge. And the modernism also pointed out that there could be an objective truth, and that objective truth is knowable. Today we will say theology is in its being rationalistic, because theology does not resist the use of man's mind. God created man as a unit, and He gave man a mind so that man can use his mind. And therefore in theology as a science we say we use our minds. We use rational methods to reach the source or to take the source that God has given us in His revelation, to collect it and systemize it. But my mind is not the source of my knowledge. I only use this mind of mine to use or to develop and systemize this source that God has given. The human subjectivity against what we have in the postmodernism today, man's subjectivity is also not the source of knowledge. Meaning how I see certain scripture pieces is not the source of knowledge. Let's take an example. The creation. I am in my being a rationalist, and the creationary tale, in my view, is just too good to be true, with respect. Things could not have developed like this. God could not just have spoken and then it was there. In other words, my perception of creation cannot and may not influence the research in such a way that that which is written there is ignored. The resurrection of Christ from death, because I today am convinced that it is medically impossible that someone can be raised from death, I cannot reproject that feeling of mine on the resurrection and make my subjectivity the source and say, because it's impossible today, then it was impossible in that time, and could Christ not be raised from death? You understand the role of subjectivity. It cannot be the source of my knowledge. Hebrews 11 verse 3. I know because I believe, or because I believe I know. That is within the postmodernism where there is space for a point of departure in faith. Science is not, or theology as a science, is not in there to prove the existence of God. A definition of science today is theology is the systemization of knowledge of God's revelation that is found in the Bible. Using methods that is owned to that specific research. And in that sense, we can classify theology as a science. Theology as a science is the systemization of knowledge of God's revelation in the Bible. And the nature of the Bible leads me to it that I take certain methods which is typical only to theology. Just like the nature of the source of research in the natural sciences leads to them using certain methods which is owned to them. What now going forward? What now? We have now discussed how science developed in the Middle Ages, the postmodernism, what role faith plays in science, how theology can be classified as a science, and now we must say there's a specific types of theologies. It's now all good and well that theology is said to be a science, but now there's different types of theology. We get Reformed theology, we have the Roman Catholic theology, Anglican theology, we have freedom theology, and now we will try and describe what type of theology do we practice here. What type of theology is used here, and what is used, how can we use that knowledge to judge other theologies? And so the first step now is what type of theology is being used or practiced here at this faculty. And that is that you will write test on. And now everybody's awake. I'll just take you back to your fundi. For those students that are on the that is not in Potchefstroom but is looking, you will see here we are here at study unit 2.4. We discussed it today. Study unit 3.1 and 3.2 is about the types of theology that we discuss here to describe it, and we will, on those 2 units, we will write a test, but not next week. Because it is 2 study units which is on the same thing, I put it together and I give you 2 weeks time to prepare for it on that reading work of 3.1 and 3.2. Apologies, the context students, which one of you is from the Pentecost tradition? He's not here. Everybody here stand within the Reformed tradition. Are you Pentecost? Okay. With these study units from 3.1 up until study unit 3.2, the paths diverge, meaning there is 2 parts in terms of study unit 3.1 up to 4.2, a Reformed theology and a Pentecostal one. Let me quickly take you to back to the module content. Study unit 3.1 or 3.2, you will find a bit of information there. Study units 3.1 and 3.2, which is study units of TEOL111, where a difference is made between the Pentecostal approach and the Reformed approach to the content of these specific ones. The Reformed part is shown in section A. You will see here there's a subsection A and section B is contained in section B. Student who choose to follow section A will be guided by Prof. Sarel van der Walt. Contact and telematic students who choose to follow section B are requested to contact Prof. Marius Nel. He will guide you through section B. There is his email address. He will take you through part, subject, or section B. And that's just the English version of that. Now, there's 2 parts here in terms of study unit 3.1 or 3.2. If you choose to do subsection B from a Pentecostalistic paradigm, then you go to subsection B, and there's study unit 1 and study unit 2. But contact Prof. Marius Nel, it's for the telematic as well as the contact students. If you come in from a Pentecostal part, you work with section B. Contact him, that he will guide you. Just for interest sakes, there's shown it is section B, Pentecostal, and there's all of the information, along with the reading work that is required of you. Contact them so that they can guide you through that. We go back even more. Section A, that is the part that I do. There you will find it. You need about 9 hours. Remember, it's across 2 weeks because it's 2 study units that has to be prepared. This is the outcomes. And then I say here, study the relevant material for both 3.1 and 3.2 as shown in the reading guide. And then, very important here, contact students. That's the students who sit here in front of me in the contact sessions. They study the work so that you are able to, on Wednesday the 18th of March, that's in 2 weeks' time, can write a class test on both study units 3.1 and 3.2. The telematic students, you read and study the material and complete the assignment below. The telematic students do the assignment below, and you also hand it in 2 weeks' time. It is shown on the assignment itself. We will, in 2 weeks' time, in other words, on the 18th of March, you will sit here and you will write a test. which will take about 3/4 of an hour in the terms of, say, 45 minutes. We won't have class. You will get here and you will write test. If you're not here, you won't have a mark for that class test. You'll have 0. The week thereafter, in other words, the 25th of March, then we discuss the content of that class test. I discuss the class test with you so that you can see where you made mistakes, so that you can have answers and can be up to speed with that work. And from there, we handle the module going further. Is that clear for you? I hope it is clear for the telematics students. If there's questions on this, then you can please contact me. Remember now, guys, we don't see each other next week, only in 2 weeks' time for a test. Thank you.